All right. I suppose I'm actually surprised how many people are in this room for a panel with that title. This is why MAGFest is great.
Excuse me.
All have access to this amazing arcade and concerts going on right now, a huge console area, and you're here in this room to talk about
watching two randos.
Postmodernism. All right, I guess we can just get started.
Yeah, so let's get this show on the road.
My name is Rim DeCoster. I host a podcast called Geek Nights. I study game design, game theory, theory of games. I give talks on that kind of thing.
And I'm Emily Compton. I am Rim's partner, and I've been working in the indie game space since 2007.
Animator, technical artist.
Yeah, I'm kind of a generalist, but I tend to bill myself as an animator.
Yeah, so the whole purpose of this talk, we're just gonna dive right in. We are not experts here. We're proposing something new. This is a thesis. We might be crazy and wrong. I don't know if we're onto something or not, and part of why we want to give this talk is to see if maybe we're onto something and any of you out there see the same thing that we see. So to step through a thesis, this is what we think is happening, and the next 55 minutes after that, we are going to go into detail about how and why and what this all entails. Of course, art is a reflection of society. I think that's a relatively easy thing that we could say and agree. Games are arts. MAGFest is the perfect example of that. Video games are a new medium of art. I think that's something we really need to remember. Video games were invented in the lifespan of people in this room. They are a brand new media, just like when cinema appeared or the printing press appeared. We lived through an era where a new form of art emerged. The world, right now, is definitely in a destabilizing era. From the shameful results of the US election, the largest land war in Europe since World War II, very clearly the world is going through a tumultuous time right now. A new era of art, we believe, appears to be emerging in reaction to this, much like other eras of art have emerged in reaction to other tumultuous times.
Even if it's not an era, we've definitely noticed certain themes and patterns which I think kind of in our minds, fit into this thesis statement.
I'll also say I used the word era because I had to fit it into this silly generator.
Little Castlevania thing.
But this new era of art, whatever it is reflected in all forms of art. This is in film, it's in cinema.
We're going to talk about a lot of these different mediums like illustration or movies.
But this era, whatever it is uniquely reflected in video games specifically.
And I think another thing why we wanted to do this talk is because video games as a medium has certain qualities having to do with interactivity that I think make it specifically well suited for dealing with these kind of topics.
So this is where we're going to take you over the next hour. And if this is not what you signed up for, then feel free to leave the room. But this is what we think is happening. So we have to talk about some concepts first. This is not going to be a deep dive into the theory of modernity, but there are some key points from the concept of modernity, the modern world that we live in, that are very relevant to be able to talk about this art movement. I'm not going to go deep, but modernity broadly is an era of human society. It likely began in the late 1700s in its earliest stages. It is continuing today.
Kind of started with the Enlightenment.
It continues into the future. And it is a set of societal conditions and a set of changes in society that together have had a number of profound effects on how humans organize, interact with each other, and has created an environment that is fundamentally different from the eras before. Now, really, we're just going to focus on these key areas of modernity. We could give I'd love to give a whole talk on modernity.
This is like semesters worth of stuff.
Yeah, I'm kind of obsessed with it, but the key points about modernity relevant to this art movement: one, delocalization.
What is local is global and vice versa.
The idea that in a modern world, as opposed to a pre-modern world, something that happens on the other side of the world can directly ruin your day. Your lives are directly impacted by events overseas, by events far away. The world, the global and the local, all become the same thing. You don't live in an isolated world or a very slow-moving world separate from the broader world like a pre-modern society may. Disconnection. Disembedding is a word you'll see if you read about this as well. The idea that in a modern society, we are largely experiencing the world mediated by other people, by organizations, So the world we experience, we watch the news, we don't experience these things directly. We interact with systems as opposed to interacting with people at an increasing scale, and this does disconnect us from other parts of society that we may have interacted with more directly in the past.
Does anyone know what this is referencing? He bears a banner that says Excelsior.
Ever upward.
Yeah, which is the New York State motto, by the way. But in this poem, this lad right here, it doesn't end well for him necessarily, going ever upward.
It's a poem about a kid who is Excelsior, ever upward, and hiking up into the mountains and will always be going higher and striving forward forever. And he freezes to death and dies. The end. But in modernity, progress is this idea that the world is progressing at an accelerating pace. The word dynamism is used a lot in the study of modernity. Progress, however, is not necessarily always good.
It just means going. You're going. You don't necessarily say that like where you're gonna end up is a place you want to be, but there's this idea of like this hockey stick of like accelerating growth or accelerating momentum.
And in earlier parts of modernity, a lot of art and a lot of society and a lot of thinking would focus on the idea that all progress is good. We are moving forward towards some platonic ideal of society.
Away from the bad past, toward the good future.
And nothing bad happened at any point in modernity. Reflexivity. This is also a very deep and complex topic. This applies to sociology, to people, to societies, to civilizations. But broadly, it's the idea that things like people or bureaucracies are reflexive. They are observing themselves. They are observing the world. They are changing themselves and, as a result, attempting to change the world based on what they see. It's like this feedback loop of self-reflection and self-improvement.
And it also kind of, it's a little bit of a change in relation to the position of an observer. Like if you think about in physics, for example, you might want to think like the idea that somebody observing a particle is not necessarily interacting with that particle, but by its very nature, just the act of observing means that you're interacting with it.
Yeah, we're all
so it's
interacting
the same
with each
thing
other
with
right
society.
now.
You're
hearing sound waves bouncing off of us. We've got photons interacting with each other. We're deeply entangled right now in this room.
To theorize and to observe is not to be apart from.
But this idea that a society, for example, observing itself, that the act of observation will reveal insights that then cause that society to change. There are other ways to describe this. I like the word juggernaut. I've seen this in a number of essays on modernity.
I want to say we had talked about this concept many times, but this a few months ago was actually the first time I had heard it used, that word used to describe a system.
So one of those aspects of modernity from that really dense slide I skipped right past is the idea that society became systematized. We started having bureaucracies and systems that replaced individuals and their individual expertise. Those bureaucracies were themselves reflexive and thus became more efficient at doing whatever it is they were doing. Case in point, the Prussian military got really good at being the Prussian military. That was not necessarily a good thing for society. Yeah. It just happened.
A juggernaut can be a lot of different things. Basically, if you can think a lot of concepts like economic theories, like we were joking about communism, we were joking about capitalism, thinking about nation states, the idea that a structure or a concept of a thing can be a different entity than its individual parts. Kind of like the particle system and the particle, to use a game design term.
And large systems like MAGFest is a juggernaut. MAGFest is an organization that is more complex than the individual people who run it in some ways, so that it may make decisions itself around how it's structured that weren't necessarily made by a specific person in the organizational structure of MAGFest. Many of you might work at a company that does weird stuff that doesn't make sense. We all see governments do things that might not necessarily make sense, that you wouldn't expect someone to have asked those governments to do. The idea of the juggernaut is that humans have made these structures, and these structures are more powerful than us. They have unlocked the bounty of modernity. That is what allowed industrialization to happen. But we can't actually control them.
Except maybe Squirrel Girl. Sorry, that was a deep cut.
Society is effectively a collection of juggernauts. Your family is a little juggernaut. MAGFest is a juggernaut. The Democratic Party is a juggernaut. The United States is a juggernaut. NATO is a juggernaut. All these institutions, larger than us, are interacting with each other in the world. And while we have some influence, we are largely, as individual people, just along for the ride. And this is a metaphor that's used heavily.
Yeah, and partly because of this, the stuff we mentioned before, like the fact that progress isn't universally good, and the fact that you get this kind of delocalization and this kind of alienation because of it. I feel like modernity has brought with it a certain amount of disillusionment and a break with the past.
And most writing on modernity, they seem to always like to frame the move from pre-modern to modern society as a divorce, something to be mourned, that the world changed and you can't go back. She's not going to come back to you. It's over. You have to move forward into the new world. The new world might not be better, but it is different and you can never go back. And the metaphor of divorce is in lots of the writing about modernity.
Yeah, and in the game that exists on this slide.
But at the same time, you have this divorce from the old world. Now you're in a new uncertain world. In the early parts of modernity, there was definitely, think about futurist art. Think about the way society liked to look at itself in America in the 50s. Everything's great. Society's moving forward. We live in a modern...
We're gonna go to space. It's amazing.
Enlightened age. And then as we hit this disillusionment, now we're questioning our decisions. Some people have gone to the extreme of questioning whether or not modernity was something that humans should have accepted. Other people want to change modernity. But
they want to get back together with the past, and they're like, please, baby, come back.
Or maybe they want to seek some different future we haven't envisioned before. But whatever they feel, they are disillusioned, and many of us might be disillusioned with the current world, but we can't go back to any of the previous worlds we've ever inhabited, so all we can do is look forward.
And so partly these things, especially the disillusionment and the fact that modernity brought with it so many challenges, it led to people really reevaluating the idea of progress, or even the idea, like the metaphysical idea of truth. You know, like the one universal, goal or one universal goodness in the world. And so basically, postmodernism is almost like the breakup, right? It's like the mirror shatter through which we view society. This mirror, this lens shatters into a million pieces, and everyone has their own perspective. And there's kind of like a decoherence of the idea of society and what it's all about.
Yeah, we're all looking at the same society in the mirror, and yet we all see very different things about it. We start to lose trust with each other. The economy of trust is a big part of modernity. The idea that because you live in this world of juggernauts, you have to decide which of them to trust, because you can't interface with anything directly. Do you trust doctors, or do you trust horse paste?
So this is like the quintessential postmodern tweet here. I think this tweet is really important. I think this is like a fundamental postmodernist statement about the world. This is the problem, right? With the shattered mirror and the extreme idea of the relativity it brings, is that like, if you don't have this universal dictate about truth and about like what is good and what is bad and how the world is, then you're gonna end up kind of muddled there.
You become unmoored. It's very easy to get nihilistic. It's very easy to start to believe that if I can't know the whole truth and there is no universal truth, then I can't judge anything and therefore nothing matters. And this is an almost depressive spiral that art and society can get into reflexively, especially when you start to perceive that you can't actually change the world, that even if you see something happening, you can't change the course of the juggernaut. As an aside, this tweet is art. It's also a shitpost. I would argue that, for example, Diogenes, if Diogenes had Twitter,
so now we're going to talk a little bit about my end of the woods. So yeah, art. And right here we've got
would you like the clicker?
Oh, sure.
This is the section where you have the
My
expertise.
part, yeah.
I'm just a nerd guy with video game knowledge.
I paid money and went to film school. That's my credentials. But anyway, you can see this is a piece that would probably be a postmodern type of artwork by Andy Warhol. You can see how it's kind of segmented. But one thing we are not going to talk about, just like how you refuse to define the word game in all your game design panels, I think we're going to not define the word art because it's a very fraught topic. A lot of academics have spent a lot of words trying to do this. But we will talk a little bit about like what we are considering art for the purposes of this panel. And I think this picture, it's a brain scan experiment where somebody's looking at fine art. And art in its nature, and I think part of what makes something art, is that relationship between observer and observed, like the conversation between artwork and viewer.
The art impacts you. Observing the art, it changes you in some way. You reflect on it, you think. But the person who made the art may have intended to have that change.
And there's like a lot of different mediums. Art isn't limited to like paintings on a wall, obviously. But, I think the medium can show different aspects.
Well, this is something I think about a lot. Not to quote Disco Elysium, but there's this bit where you talk about the tape recorder of the world. And I like to think of different mediums of art as if art is the reflection of society, different forms that art can take can record different aspects of society, different dimensions of society with different levels of fidelity.
Like a music will represent one facet of one part of a society, where a film might represent something different and a still image might represent something different yet again.
Think about early cinema and the idealized kinds of worlds it might portray, or the stylized worlds, versus the modern era of videography, where we have actual video of events that is part of the art form that we interact with.
This picture, I've always thought, is kind of interesting because it's putting a film of a boxing match, which is, ostensibly, especially for the time period, kind of lowbrow entertainment, putting it in a very elevated, it looks like an opera hall or a theater. Everybody's all dressed up to watch this boxing match. And so I thought I'm sure everybody's familiar with the meme, but I want to bring up the concept of gaze. And gaze is all about who is doing the looking and what they are looking at. Kind of like how I said, the relationship between the art and the observer. Gaze isn't just used in the discussion of art, but it is very useful and brought up a lot in discussions of modern art. So in this picture, it's very, very memed image. If you think about it, it's one event. But all three people probably have very different experiences of this event. Like, girl in red dress is probably like, man, I'm gonna get a bagel. She's not even thinking about it. So when somebody talks about gaze, it's about that relationship and how it affects their perception of the work. or the person or the society. So you've probably heard in video game criticism, the male gaze, you know, it's seen through the lens of this very masculine identity, or the female gaze. But there are other gazes. There are many other gazes. Like you could have the Western gaze or the Japanese gaze, or, you know, it's all about where you're situating the camera in regards to the observation.
And that's a very important concept, because I just mentioned videography before. Videography does not portray the world as it is. It portrays the world that someone chose to portray.
And, you know, there's also the idea of different lenses. You know, like everybody, if we're using the metaphor of a camera, everyone is looking through their own lens, which will be colored by their own meta. And we'll get into that later, like why meta, but.
And this is where I think something very important. I think art, it's very easy to argue that art is the sensory mechanism of society. If a society is this aggregate, complex juggernaut that's bigger than all of us, how does it see itself? Because societies are reflexive. And I would argue that art is that mechanism. Societies are reflexive via the art that they produce and consume. And sometimes art, for example, The Jungle, that is art that changed a society. Society read that book, they took the wrong message away.
They were like, you rat poop in the sausage, instead of, we need to be nicer to immigrant labor.
But this was art that reflected a negative part of society back at itself, and then society reflexively started to evolve and change because of that art. Soviet realism is portraying a very specific kind of idealized view. I would like to say sometimes art is what society wants you to know about itself. It is what society wants itself to become.
Kind of idealized or aspirational, maybe.
It's how we form consensus. It's basically how society itself is able to be reflexive and evolve in the world and change and grow. And it's a loop. It's reflexive. Society creates an environment that makes art. Art then influences society. Society then creates more art.
And I mean, it doesn't have to have this kind of propagandistic intent in order to change society. It might be just observing, but like we said, there is no such thing as an unattached observer.
A really good example, to bring it back to games. Monopoly today has a very nice-looking billionaire on it, and it's portrayed as a fun game.
It's a fun family game. Do you know where it came from?
Monopoly. MAGFest is the kind of con where people would know this. Monopoly
Yeah.
is based on a game called The Landlord's Game that was designed to not be fun and was designed to show the inequities of society.
Real
and how an
estate monopolies.
Unregulated and unconstrained capitalism takes people who start the same and ruins them.
And then you're sitting around with your aunt and uncle and little siblings playing a 4-hour game.
But if these are all art that are reflecting some aspect of society, then Monopoly is art that is reflecting that aspect of society. Monopoly was created originally as a form of activist arts. Also, there are alternate rules in that game where there is regulation and taxes, and the game plays very differently.
So this is a bit of a contrast between, a lot of times when people talk about modern art, they talk about like non-figurative art. And modern art is very specifically kind of starting in the late 1800s, there were a group of artists that made this break with tradition, and they liked, again, you have the idea of progress, you have the idea of wanting to paint your truth and art for art's sake, and let us show the world using these novel painting methods, but that are often taking from a lot of primitive art form.
And partly driven by the fact that society had all these new forms of art and new tools and a bounty of modern progress that allowed the creation of this art.
So on one side, you've got like this Fauvist lady with hat. And it's all about being authentic. And like I said, the idea of art with a capital A was elevated. And then following this kind of, breakup or this kind of disillusionment.
The two great wars?
Yeah,
Post-Modernist.
World War II in particular, I think shook society up enough that people no longer felt this need to search for the kind of like, let us make true art. And instead, they, I mentioned reflexivity, but they also, just like how, I really like, this is a Barbara Kruger piece, and she used a lot of photograph and collage and text in her artwork, but I love this one because it's shattered. And it's all about like, you are not yourself. I was just like, this is perfect. But it's also not just irony and parody, but it's recycling. It's taking the old and remixing it and cutting it up and really questioning reality and being like, instead of saying true art, be like, what even is art? What's the point? Let's make it all into a mishmash and see what comes out.
So this slide, Skibbity Toilet has to be talked about.
So
this
over
is
here
not
we
the
have
first time a toilet has been
has been taken and elevated to a position of an artwork. So this is The Fountain by Duchamp. He took a mass-produced urinal, signed a pseudonym on it, and put it in a gallery. And that caused a lot of people to bicker on and on about, like, what is art? This is not art. How could this be art? But that's a very postmodern thing to do, kind of almost making fun of the idea and promoting that kind of questioning of the definition and the reality of an art form. And Skibbity Toilet by Da Fuck Boom is also made with found assets. It's building on a lot of the source filmmaker stuff. It was made one of the most popular video series in the world. But a lot of people, The Fountain is often used as one of the primary examples of an art movement called Dadaism. And Dadaism was very much about this kind of idea of ridiculousness, and it's like, oh, whatever, It was a thoughtful sort of nonsense. And I have heard like Gen Z humor and Gen Z media described by multiple people, including academics, as like a return of the Dadaist sentiment. And so I think often these kind of, these postmodern movements are sparked from, sometimes when people are faced with a breaking of their past world or this alienation caused by modernity, they get bummed out and depressed. And sometimes they just, nothing matters, let's make nonsense.
But I point out a difference between these. The Skibbity Toilets isn't just nonsense. There
is a narrative.
The
There's
toilets
a good
are the
side
bad
and
guys.
a bad side. It takes a stance.
I don't want to be in the same room as the person who watches Skibbity Toilet and is on the toilet's side. Also, there's a great video a while back where Adam Conover was doing a talk with about union organizing and a live stream.
It was during the film.
And during the film strike, and one of his buddies mentioned Skibbity Toilet, and he's like, "What's that?"
What is that?
And the guy says, and I'm quoting exactly, "Adam, if I explain to you what Skibbity Toilet is, you'll have an aneurysm."
And then he proceeded to explain it, and it's a highly entertaining video.
But just like, think about the memento mori, the skull, a reaction to mass death, and the reminder that your life is fragile and one day you will die. The era when people would have a pondering skull on their desk.
Yeah, like in the Victorian times, people would die a lot randomly.
But then in a later era, now we've got the share zone, a skeleton who also recognizes that he will one day die, but instead of seeing this as a negative, he's going to smoke weed and play video games and try not to do work.
Steal paper clips from his work.
So these forms continue to get recycled, and whatever's happening here, I think that Skibbity Toilet is an early example of something happening a little bit beyond this postmodern Dadaism. It might not be
postmodern. It might be something beyond postmodern.
So game mechanics specifically, forget the art of games. Games through the lens that I look at them. Games are just math when I look at them, especially board games.
You see through the matrix.
I don't care about the theme. I honestly am just focused on the mechanics. But the mechanics of these games are very clearly modern or postmodern. Puerto Rico and John Company are both games about the depredations of colonialism. These games are dealing with extremely fucked up themes. slavery, violence, extraction of resources, mercantilism.
You are playing as the colonizer.
Yeah, you're in Puerto Rico, you're running the plantation. This is one of the most famous and well-designed board games of all time, and you are running a plantation. That's messed up. John Company, you are running the John Company that destroyed India. But these games mechanically do something very interesting. Puerto Rico is a modern game mechanically. Puerto Rico simulates that horror.
It's about progress. It's about profits. If you don't think about the theme too hard, it's a very straightforward, like, make the best company and trading empire you can.
Like, civilization games are also very modern mechanical games. They simulate and reflect, but they do not criticize or interrogate. John Company is about these same things, but John Company is brilliant. John Company is a deeply postmodern game. John Company, you play the families who ended up running the John Company, the East India Company. And your incentives are basically to marry your daughter off and get respect in society and get a nice hat. And by playing this game, you run this company, India gets destroyed, you ruin the world, but you've got your nice hat at the end of the day. You're so disentangled from the consequences of your actions. This game almost is like a simulation
parody.
of why did these people do these things. It puts you in their context. It gives you the same incentives they had, and then it makes you interrogate the results of your actions. Where, as opposed to this modern game that is deeply non-critical, John Company is a game that you should all play.
Reflexivity.
Yes.
And this is kind of an interesting thing. This is one of the things that kind of got us on this this whole
This is
panel
why we're
discussion.
doing this panel.
Is we were in MAGFest walking through the artist alley, and we noticed some aesthetic themes that they were too common to be ignored. Like, everybody in the artist alley, there's such a diversity of work in there. So it's like you can't paint it with a broad brush, but seeing all these different independent artists showing some of these themes made me think about how it might relate to what's going on in the world. And so this is my little segment about illustration. Yep. One thing I noticed was the idea of, kind of the aesthetics of death, but also transformation and rebirth. So if you can see way over on the left there, there's like a woman molting her skin like an insect. There's this obsession with nature and decay and like fungi. Mushrooms had a moment a few years ago. I feel like everybody was doing like how cool fungal aesthetics looked, and the other thing I've noticed is the kind of shattering of forms. Like, you'll see almost like artistic gore, but it's like cross sections of humans and animals, and like the one over in gray and black there with the lotus. There's like this shattering of forms, but there's also this kind of godlike transformation where you can see like multiple eyes, and it's not always framed in like a body horror kind of way. It's more like a transformative sort of way.
And this isn't like the majority of the art in the artist alleys. This isn't like an overwhelming movement. It's more that these themes, we kept seeing them popping up in all these different contexts, kind of independent of each other just in the last 4 or 5 years. I did walk through the alley and take one count.
Yeah.
I counted 21 distinct pieces of art in the artist alley that had someone who may have been dead or was laying there in some fashion, had mushrooms growing out of them.
Yeah, like it's so common. It made me think a lot, like, how are the societal forces acting upon art of the sort we take in at MAGFest?
Yep, and the eyes thing really stood out. I stopped counting. There are so many instances now of art everywhere with this common theme of more than 2 eyes, extra eyes, almost like an awakening. Think about the word.
Or multiple gazes.
Yeah, multiple gazes, seeing the world from different perspectives, seeing a new perspective, perhaps seeing the context of the world we live in.
So.
These also exist. Also a shit poster.
So So I know, like, we're a bunch of nerds here, and as nerds, I know we like to complain about, like, that's canon, that's not canon, or I like this, I don't like this, and, you know, they shouldn't have put that in the new Star Trek, and, you know, those Klingons aren't right. But I feel like the idea of canon it kind of comes from originally, like, religious stuff. It's like, which books are canonical or deemed to be included in the official version of the religion.
I grew up going to a Catholic school, and the best way it was ever described as which gospels count.
So basically, canonical works and the idea of canon is broken in a lot of the ideas of postmodernism.
Yep, so if we talked about a bunch of artistic themes that we think we've seen that may be part of this movement, then this is a narrative theme that has come up increasingly.
We're going to talk about movies!
And it's this idea of multiverses. Now, multiverses were used in art before.
In comics.
Yeah, there's comics from the 70s with, like, the multiverse, whatever.
But you've gotten to the point where modern media has made it so that there are so many iterations on a given property or a given character that trying to reconcile them all into a singular canon is nigh impossible. And so you're starting to get these multiversal works that aren't just about, you know, dealing with a multiverse, like you said, that's been in superhero comics for a really long time, but it really goes deep into the meta of what multiverses are about. And so Spider-Verse, I think everyone should go see that movie if they haven't, and the two movies that are out now are some of my favorite movies. Can't wait for the third.
And on one hand, they sort of deconstruct this idea of a multiverse, and they bring the concept of Spider-Man into the context of all the other Spider-Men that are out there, and not to spoil the Spider-Verse, but the movies make a pretty clear statement about multiverses, about canon. And what I will say is that all the movies we're about to step through are saying the same thing and engaging with the concept of multiverses the same way. Even though you probably haven't seen all of these things, they may seem radically different. I think they're all saying the same basic thing.
Yeah.
We've got
one of the highest grossing R-rated movies of all time. Deadpool, I think, he's definitely the postmodern superhero. He breaks the fourth wall. He's aware that he's in a comic book. But this movie, again, takes on the idea of the multiverse, but he's very much fixated on I don't care that there's billions of different realities. I care about my reality. That's what's important to me. Mm-hmm. And it is connected very closely with another Marvel property. It features some of the same storylines as Marvel's Loki. You can see in the background, there's this branching of
literal timelines.
Yeah, timelines. And that is a television show that basically talks about, multiverses.
Rick and Morty actually is better than a lot of people might think in that it is really addressing this exact same theme. If you watch this entire show, it really focuses on the same idea of pick one reality, make that one better. Don't paralyze yourself in this infinite multitude and this loss of truth. Pick one, make it better, move forward, just like Spider-Verse.
Another excellent film.
If you haven't seen this movie, just go see it without knowing anything else about it.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil it, but... And Lower Decks, Star Trek, also, despite the director of this saying, multiverses are so silly, let's end with a multiverse storyline.
But they all do something interesting, and Lower Decks is a good example where they're in the context of the creation of the works themselves. In Lower Decks, they show two characters have a homosexual romance that was not allowed to happen in the original Star Trek.
So they basically said, okay, the original canon wouldn't allow this. Guess what? All bets are off. We have a freaking multiverse. We can do whatever we want. But the other thing that all these TV shows and movies have in common is that they presuppose that there are infinite worlds and infinite different variations. There's fan fiction even, there's so many different ways it could go. But they also don't neglect to focus on like the characters having a world or a timeline or issues that are important to them. So I think it takes that postmodern nihilism and reins it in a little bit. And the characters are able to kind of make these choices and be like, well, I will protect my home reality. Maybe not at the expense of everybody else, but I will protect it.
And of course, Arcane.
That was going from Mr. Modern Jace to Mr. Postmodern. Progress is great.
Arcane, when I heard there was going to be a League of Legends cartoon, I wanted nothing to do with that.
I really had to sell you on it.
I do not like MOBAs mechanically, it's a whole thing. But this is a phenomenal work of art.
Beautiful.
So video games. I think video games are uniquely able to express some of these themes, so we need to talk a little bit about video games and metacontextualism.
So meta is kind of like this prefix that is something about something. It's like a metadata is data about data. It's basically like one step up, and again, reflexive. You are observing the thing itself.
Yep, self-referential, transcendent. We're nerds. We use the word meta all the time in our lives. But contextualism, context, understanding the context of things that happen in the world. The context, those two characters kissing in Lower Decks, without the context of the fact that that was literally disallowed by the previous writers and the previous studio, that context changes your perception of it. So metacontextualism is a word we just made up.
We like to coin words.
We were trying to figure out what to call this thing, and we decided to call it metacontextualism. I don't know if it's the right word.
But spoilers, postmodernism doesn't actually mean modernism and modernity is over. Neither does this necessarily mean that postmodernism isn't a thing anymore, but it's more like we wanted to talk about with, for example, having viewed all these movies and played all these games, the idea of now you know that the world's viewpoint is shattered and everyone has their own relative perception of what's going on, but we still need to make our own context and move through the world trying to do what's right.
So if the pre-modern world broadly is characterized as there is a Platonic ideal in the past that we must maintain or return to, and then modernity, or modern thinking in modernity, was the idea that there is this Platonic ideal in the future that we will progress ever forward toward. Postmodernity was running into the consequences of modernity and having the two most horrific wars in human history back to back. And metacontextualism then, it might be the idea that we have to move forward anyway. One idea of postmodernity is that there is no truth. There is no universal truth, as we talked about before. So you almost become paralyzed by the idea that if there is no universal truth, how can I know anything? I would argue a next phase, metacontextualism, part of this is the idea that you can never have the whole truth. You will never know everything. You will never have that objective context. You've got to use what you got. You got to use the context you see around you and make your decision.
You're always going to have a very subjective perception because it's you perceiving it. But you can also make a first best guess about the world.
That is from a talk. There's a talk,
about animal sentience.
About
but
animal
don't
cognition.
Even go there because we don't have time. I could talk about that all day.
But that line is important. The idea of when in doubt, whatever context you have, that is your first starting point, your best guess. Start with that and expand from there.
So I like to think about this like metacontextualism. Instead of if progress is a straight line, an arrow pointing toward the future, and the postmodern loop is you get stuck in this cycle of reflexivity where everything just gets churned around and you don't know how or which way to move forward. I would say that metacontextualism is kind of like an iterative loop. So you're kind of like coiling around and you're still reflexive, but you pick a direction and you're like, is this the way to go? Is this the way? And so you use your perception in order to make these decisions and construct your worldview. And why are video games relevant to this?
Bunch of text, don't worry about that. We'll share the slides so you
But
can read this in more detail.
I feel like it's important because every time you start a video game, it's kind of like you're dropped into a whole new scenario, like a new world with a set of rules. You know, there are parameters on.
I'm a plumber and there's this mushroom walking toward me. I don't know what he wants.
Like, do I jump? So it's basically you're put in a game, you play the tutorial, you make your game play based on context, especially with branching narratives and adventure games, which is the genre we're going to focus on today. You kind of figure it out from the cues the games gives you, the context, and you also bring your own meta to the table. You bring your life experience and everything. Those might make you have a very different playthrough than your friend, so it's okay that it's different. In fact, it's kind of great that you'll have a different experience with this artwork, because everybody has different experiences with, you know, watching the same movie or looking at the same artwork, but games make it very literal because of their mechanics.
So, we've got 3 case studies, light spoilers for these 3 games, but not catastrophic spoilers. But we think these 3 games will be descriptive rather than prescriptive. These games are deeply enmeshed in whatever this art movement is. And we're going to explore some of the themes in these games that we think are reflective of that. Starting
So
with
Night in the Woods. Night in the Woods is, I played it for the first time last year, and it's an example of what I like to call a couch game, where it doesn't necessarily have to be played single player, and we can sit on the couch together and make decisions together. And so we played it together, and to give you a little bit of context, the setting is May drops out of college and comes home to her town, which is like a
Pennsylvania
small,
coal town.
Yeah, basically, it's in the Rust Belt.
Well, the fascinating thing about
so many people say, "Oh my gosh, that's my town," and like everybody. And I even went last summer up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I was thinking a lot about this game because she comes back to her town amid the ruins of industry. This is a town that progress has left behind. Look, jobs.
And it just puts you in this context. And everyone we know who grew up in a small Pennsylvania town that's collapsing like this game spoke to them deeply.
And the other thing that I thought was really cool about this, there's a mini game where you're looking at the stars with your old teacher from high school. And he's really nice, and he'll tell you these different made-up fables. But this one was about a town encircled by one big snake, and they're realizing that it's all one big snake.
Yep, there's a town crushed by a snake, and there's another town that also is crushed by a snake, and one day all the towns
realize it's the
all
same big snake.
The
And
snake
so
is capitalism.
we will talk, it could be a lot of different things, but it is a juggernaut. It's having this idea and using the metaphor of the big snake to talk about the idea of these systems and these huge unapproachable mechanisms of society.
That almost awakening to that context of seeing what's actually happening, seeing them, and thus, even if you can't change them, you at least recognize them.
And another big theme in the game is this kind of loss of sense of self. Like, May doesn't know what she wants to do with her life, or even like, you know, who she really is. And she struggles a lot. And so to the point where she even later on in the game discusses having a psychotic break when she was a younger, like a high school student. And everything just kind of didn't make sense to her, and all the people just looked like shapes. There was like a loss of coherence. You can see like the dissociation that she struggles with, and not being able to kind of piece together.
Losing your context, losing truth, losing your lens on the world, and having to rebuild everything.
And then there's disconnection on individual level. So in this part, there are a certain group of people who they are disillusioned by modernity, the fact that the town has, closed all the mines, and they remember a time where things used to be good and that they had plentiful union jobs. But instead of trying to make things better, they become a scary cult. So maybe this is the people who cannot deal with that break with the past. And also the fact that they are very disconnected from the town itself.
There's a moment in the game where, let's say, people in that cult, many of them are not around anymore. And you go back into town the next day, and you're thinking, who's going to be missing? Who was the MAGA nut job? Like, who were the scary uncles? And then you realize no one's missing from the town, because those people are not connected to you and are not connected to anyone you know. They have disconnected themselves from society.
But there's also the idea of this is kind of the good way to go about it. This is the metacontextual ending to the game, where the father, who used to have a good union job, decides that he's going to make his current job a good union job down at what is the game's equivalent of a Walmart. And so it's not much, but it shows the characters starting to make these efforts to put their world back together, even though they can't go back to, say, what it was like to be friends in high school, or they couldn't go back to when the town was flourishing. They can take what they've got and move into a future. And this is kind of how the game, I feel like it was a very moving ending, because not everything's fixed, people still struggling, but the idea of getting the band back together, and even though your relationship with your friends has changed, you're still able to take what you've got and make an effort to make it good.
Yep, the old world has died, but the new world could be better. And there's so many themes like this in this game. You should play this game. Disco Elysium might be the second most metacontextual game I have seen. If you haven't played it, you should play it. But this is a word I made up like 15 years ago in a talk at the Penny Arcade Expo. If an ortho game is a competitive game, an ideo game is a game where you make a series of interesting or meaningful decisions that lead to a personal outcome. Meaning the game, Disco Elysium, has pretty much the same story of investigating this murder, no matter how you play it. But depending on what character you choose, and depending on how you play the game, your experience will be very different from your friend's experience. Everyone has their own personal experience with the game from the decisions they make in the course of the game. Taking the actions matters. You go through this world on your own terms and experience it in a unique way. This isn't just the broken promises of modernity. Disco Elysium is set in the absolute apocalypse of modernity. The revolution failed. You're living in the shadow of the counter-revolution. You're living in a world where all the good people have lost. Capitalism reigns supreme.
And there are bullet holes in the walls.
Yep. And it explores, how do you pick up the pieces in a world like that? How do you even keep on living? It doesn't just have a theme of showing you the juggernauts. In this game, the juggernauts talk to you. I am not arguing that the juggernauts are sentient. The bureaucracy at my day job is not sentient yet.
But it's give it time. But I feel like it's good to be able to recognize these things as forces that are acting upon your life.
Well, think if a city, like in the game, you have this Shivers set, and the city talks to you. A city like New York City is not sentient, but it is an institution, a juggernaut. It's reflexive. It changes. It reflects the people in it.
I was just thinking of The City We Become, or
The City We Become by N.K. Jemisin is a great metacontextualist book about this topic.
About anthropomorphization of cities.
But if they make decisions kind of on their own, how do we interact with them? One of the fantasies of a lot of games is having agency in a world where we increasingly see that we have no way to impact these juggernauts around us. The fantasy of this game is that you can talk to the juggernaut and learn something from it, and maybe get it to change its direction. You don't just have a loss of self. In this game, you wake up with amnesia. You are naked and alone, and you don't even know your own name. The game gives you nothing. Your context is,
I'm in a room. What's going on?
What the hell happened? But at the same time, the game is about building context. You have nothing to go on. You're in an alien world with no memories. The only context you have is you as the player. You have an idea of what is good and what is bad, and you bring that into the game, and you build a context in the game from your own first principles. I think that is the kind of theme we're seeing in games that are part of this movement.
And this is one of my favorite scenes in the game, too. It's like basically you kind of discovering why this car is stuck in the ice.
This game is about how the decisions you make change you. Your reflection of yourself. The game has a mechanic in the early game where you have to decide if you're even willing to look at yourself in the mirror. And if you never do, you never see yourself.
Interestingly, I feel like all the games we're going to talk about today have a mirror scene.
I feel like mirrors are a big part of...
No, sorry, I keep saying that.
But the character grows and changes and is a reflexive being, and the game's art and mechanics reflect that back at you. This isn't just about the divorce of modernity. This is about how you have to go forward. This game has this extended metaphor where you are divorced and you conflate your ex-wife who left you with Dolores Day, the emperor goddess of the previous era of exploration.
Who's kind of like a saint, but also like a symbol of the modern world.
And the game forces you to interrogate the fact that you are divorced. You have to move forward. The game is giving you these avenues to maybe try and win her back. And it's not talking about your wife. It's talking about the old world that you left behind. And I will not spoil the character that says this, but a character you don't expect even tells you, that woman, you need to turn away from the ruin. She was middle class. But even here, the game is exploring this idea of divorce and of moving forward. Confronting death. Artistic gore, artistic death is a big part of this game.
Yeah.
It is about a murder. You're investigating a murder.
I mean, in Night in the Woods, there was also like a poke the body with a stick
This
kind of
game
scene.
has a mini game where you perform an autopsy. In Night in the Woods, you have a mini game where you poke the dead a human's arm.
Yeah, it's like a random arm.
The game really focuses on the idea of death and change. Arguably, the death that you're investigating is the catalyst of change. Death is necessary for
Death
evolution.
of the past.
But also transformation and rebirth. The game really explores this idea that the world can change. No matter how low things are, the people who want the world to be different are slowly finding each other and building these connections. But at the same time, that transformation, not everyone's going to come through the other side. Revolutions are violent and bloody and horrible, and this game explores that idea of how much death is acceptable in order to have a rebirth. How much death is necessary for a transformation. Baldur's Gate, you can play the good guys, you can play bad guys. The game doesn't judge you for making decisions. This game doesn't do the thing that a lot of AAA games do, where did you save the orphans or did you drown the orphans? This game, there is a fascist side quest you can take. And if you take this side quest, it makes you stupider, it makes you uglier, it makes you less happy. It's just bad. The game makes fun of you. This game has a context, and it kind of punishes you for straying from that context and making decisions that are not objectively bad, but it's bad to be a fascist, I would say.
Here.
And in our last 5 minutes.
Our last one is, I think this one is very interesting because it also, it's less about society and more about narrative and the context in narrative and constructing things from first principles.
This game is a very simple visual novel. Get put on a path in the woods. There's a narrator speaking to you. There is a cabin at the end of the path. And in that cabin, there is a princess.
And you must kill her.
That princess, or the world will be destroyed. And that's
The world
it.
will end.
The world will end. That's the game. That's it. You've got nothing. You think the guy in Disco Elysium had nothing to go on? You've got nothing in this game.
And it's a slight spoiler, but the game is a loop. You have a bunch of different iterations of this same context, but because you have played it before and been here before, you as the player, remember and will make decisions differently.
But the narrator in the game doesn't remember. So you, the player, and your character remember things that the narrator in the game does not. And it really explores that idea of the context you have brought into the world.
So you've got the player, who is yourself. You've got the vessel, which is the player character, and is comprised of basically the voices of all the past loops. And then you've got the narrator, who's a blank slate each time, who gives you just plain context. And so all these things together provide this meta context.
Talk about confronting death. This game has
It's pretty gory.
very artistic gore. But it really forces you, just like Disco Elysium, to interrogate death, to understand death. And the game does not even argue that death is bad, because death is a further context.
At the end of each loop, it says, everything goes black, and then you die. And that's just matter of fact, that's how every little mini playthrough ends. But you have to die in order to be reborn.
The game really makes this case that death and change are the same thing. It's using death and change as metaphors for each other, and it is pushing you through this evolution. It's almost like natural selection requires death to happen.
Death on an individual, don't get us wrong, we're not being
we're not saying die.
Death is bad on an individual level, but a lot of these games are making the point that, evolution is a change, and a change is by necessity leaving behind something.
The me of 20 years ago is dead. I'm a different person now. We're constantly dying and being reborn, and this game interrogates that deeply. And
then,
as we're out of time, spoilers, this game is about the fact that you build this entity from all these experiences and all these contexts. And I will not show the final spoiler, but the idea of a meta context, the game ultimately asks you to break free of the constraints of the world you see and open your eyes to the world beyond it. So I would recommend, since we're pretty much out of time, play those 3 games. And we would like to hear from you if you think any of these themes we think we see are real, if there is an art movement here. We want to hear from you because we literally made this up. I hope this was enjoyable. We look forward to hearing from all of you, and enjoy the rest of your MAGFest.